When I was 3 years old, I walked into a Presbyterian Sunday school class in Los Angeles, and that began my relationship with the Bible. As with any of us who started to come to church when we were young, it's been a circuitous route through that book. Now, if you became a Christian when you were an adult, well, you have a whole different relationship with this book. We all may end up the same place today, but we took a different path to get here. Well, for me, I grew up hearing stories of the Bible. We were read and shown on flannel boards. Remember those? We were read about Abraham walking across the desert with Sarah to the promised land. Moses in this little basket as a little baby floating through the reeds in Egypt, and David slinging a rock at Goliath. We even made a little sling ourselves in the Sunday school class. And in the New Testament, there were all these stories of Jesus teaching and healing. I still remember gathering around in awe this little model of a house, sort of like a modern house like we lived in, with a hole in the roof, and some guys lowering a sick friend down this hole to Jesus to be healed. This revered model was made out of toothpicks by a legend in the Sunday school, a guy named George. He was a few years older than we were. He was sort of the Eddie Haskell of the church. He was beloved by the parents and the teachers and the minister, polite and all that, but we knew he stole his mother's cigarettes and sold them to the younger kids, and we knew he drank his dad's whiskey. But in those days, we never heard stories of Paul except that one scene where he was knocked off his horse by a thunderbolt when he was converted. Everything else, of course, is theology. Something you can't put on a flannel board or make a toothpick model of. But as I grew older, I studied more and I grew to love this passage. It gave me hope because it was all about forgiveness. If I messed up, if I followed my sinful flesh, as Paul put it, although as a teenager I never quite was clear on what sinful flesh was, except that from the pulpit at my church it was always sex, drinking, and smoking cigarettes, and maybe even eating too many jelly donuts. But if I did that, I could be forgiven and go on my merry way. But in college I took a class on Paul and I wrote a paper on this very passage. As I read about the passage and studied what other people had written, my understanding of sinful flesh broadened beyond sex and drinking and smoking. It was more a turning away from God. I still remember, as I was typing this paper, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. A huge thunderstorm erupted across the Ohio farmland outside my dorm. I took it to mean, among other things, that I'd get an A on the paper. But seriously, it was a moving experience. I was beginning to understand Paul. But still it was, if I did the right thing, all that Matthew 25 stuff, like feeding the hungry and helping the homeless and visiting people in the prisons, if I did all that and I believed the right thing, I had faith, I could earn God's love. Later as an adult, there was the debate between works and faith, something we talked about in our Bible study last spring when we studied the book of James. Is it more important to do good deeds or to have faith? Of course, the answer that we settled on, the answer which James and Paul gave to us, is both. You do both to get salvation, to get right with God. James emphasized works, doing good. Paul emphasized faith, justification by faith. We make the effort to move towards God by our faith, our belief, Paul said. But still, all the time trying to avoid flesh or sin or that which was turning away from God. And we're rewarded with, we earn God's love. This debate was very important 100 years ago when the Reformed Church, the Presbyterian churches, among others, believed that everyone was depraved. Everyone was not a good person. Everyone was a sinner in need of help. Everyone was in need of instruction on how to be good. But here in the 21st century, we have a tendency to think about people as kind of basically good. People may do bad things, and some people may do very bad things, but we're basically good. And particularly here, you're good people. This congregation does a lot for the community. Feeding the hungry and helping those who are down and out, helping those who cannot help themselves. That's what we do. But knowing why we do something helps us understand our behavior better. And more important, it helps us understand ourselves better. Recently, a friend of mine, Ben Daniel, who you'll meet in a few weeks, introduced me to Albert Schweitzer. Not the actual Albert Schweitzer, he died about 50 years ago, but his book on Paul. And Schweitzer took a different angle at it. Schweitzer looks at two main words in the passage, spirit and flesh. For him, the most important word in the passage is one that Paul uses the most in this passage, spirit. He uses it 11 times. Spirit to Schweitzer means a connection with God's love as God expressed love in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Flesh, he feels, is easier to define. It doesn't mean sex and drinking and smoking, certainly not in Paul's first century world. But the word that is so often translated as flesh in various Bibles, it simply means in Greek, doing things that are simply not spiritually connected with God. Now, Schweitzer believes that the core of Paul's writings is focused on a spiritual connection with God's love. Not simply a belief or a faith, not something in your head, not something that you believe, which Paul talks a lot about. But he feels that people miss the point of Paul's writings. The core of his writing, Schweitzer believes, is ethical mysticism. A mysticism that drives us to do good things. This isn't some sort of pie in the sky, clouds, incense burning kind of thing, not an out-of-body experience where we become one with God and we lose ourselves in God, something sort of mystical religion kind of thing. It is by participating with our whole selves, our mind, our body, our emotion, in a real way, not in an intellectual way, in God's love as God expressed his love in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We don't earn God's love. We participate in God's love. Okay, so what? You've listened to all this and you say, so what? I have a mystical connection with Christ. So what? With all the problems in the world, who has time to be mystical? Even if it's a mystical connection with Christ, who has time for that? We are in a tumultuous time. People are getting sick, even dying, because some people just won't wear a mask. There's no end in sight for this pandemic. It seems to be even getting worse sometimes. This country is facing systematic racism, struggling with something that's been going on for years, something that you folks have lived with your whole life. The economy is struggling. People are out of work. How do we do what we know is right? More important, what drives us to do what will change the world for the better? Rather than do good in the world simply because Jesus told us to do it, or to do good in the world to earn God's love, we work to bring peace and justice into the world because we have participated in God's love as God has expressed love in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As Paul writes in this passage, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to you because his spirit lives in you. And so we are empowered to make changes in ourselves, in society, in the world around us. Amen.